Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and if you're a fan of Old West firearms, you probably divide the 19th century into two parts: before 1873 and after 1873. Because the year 1873 saw the introduction of three of the most iconic firearms of the American West: the Colt single-action Army revolver, the Winchester Model 1873 rifle, and the Model 1873 Trapdoor Springfield. So, in this episode, we're going to take a look at those iconic guns of the year 1873, and we'll start with the Colt single-action Army. The Colt single-action Army revolver may be the most recognized handgun in the entire world, and it owes that in no small part to being the star in literally thousands of Hollywood movies. But the Colt single-action Army was popular before movies were even a thing. The U.S. Army adopted the Colt single-action Army in July of 1873, and 2 months later, the first civilian sales were made. Though civilian sales lagged behind military contracts at first. Now, ultimately, during the 19th century, over 190,000 of these Colt single-action Army revolvers were made, and about 36,000 of those were military purchases. The Colt single-action Army revolver is still in production today. It's being made by the Colt Custom Shop, and the total production quantity for this gun is closing in on 500,000 revolvers made. So that's a pretty impressive total for a big bore, large handgun. You know, Colt originally tried, or I should say the Army originally tried, a 40-grain powder charge for the Colt single-action Army, and they just found it was too powerful. It was not optimal, because there's always a trade-off between power and shootability. So the military load for the early years of the Colt consisted of a 250-grain bullet with 2 grease grooves and a hollow base, and that was loaded over 30 grains of black powder. And the priming system was an internal priming system called the Bennett system. And in that system, basically, the cartridge looked like a rimfire cartridge. It had a flat base. There was no external primer. The primer was inside, on the bottom of the cartridge case, and there was an iron anvil crimped into the cartridge just above the priming compound. So the cartridge was soft copper, and the firing pin would strike the center of that soft copper, push the fulminate against the anvil, and bang, the gun went off. Now, because the Army adopted the Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver, they were in a bind as far as ammunition went. The Colt cartridge was longer than the Schofield could accommodate. And the Colt cartridge had a tiny rim. And the Schofield used a star extractor, kind of like modern double-action revolvers, and that rim would slip underneath the extractor all the time. So there was a problem. The government was using 2 kinds of ammunition. In 1882, they solved that problem. They designed a new .45 Colt, or .45 Army cartridge. And basically, it was the length of a Schofield cartridge, and it had a rim that was a little bit smaller than the original Schofield, but larger than the original Colt. So the Schofield star extractor would work with it, and you could load it in Colts, and you didn't have any problems with the rims overlapping. And they used that cartridge until 1909. Now it was replaced by the .38 Colt cartridge, which failed so miserably during the Philippine insurrection. But basically, the .45 government cartridge was in force from 1882 until 1909, when they developed a new one that was very similar, just it had a much larger rim. And that was for use in the new service revolver, .45 caliber new service revolvers. Now, the M1882 cartridge was loaded with a 230-grain bullet, over 28 grains of black powder, and it used the Boxer priming system, so it was primed the way a conventional cartridge is primed. Colt produced the single-action Army in 3 standard barrel lengths. Now, on a custom order, they would make a barrel any length you wanted. All you had to do was come up with the money. But they had 3 standard barrel lengths. In 1873, they debuted the revolver with a 7.5-inch barrel. And that was a primary military length barrel, and it was very popular with civilians, particularly in the early years. Now, in 1875, Colt started equipping single-action armies with a 5.5-inch barrel as a standard factory option. And the 5.5-inch barrel, over the entire life cycle of the Colt single-action army up until today, has proved to be the best seller of the 3 barrel lengths. The 3rd barrel length was introduced in 1879, and that was a 4 3/4-inch barrel length, where the barrel is the same length as the ejector rod housing. And that had been one of the most popular optional barrel lengths that Colt was selling on special orders. So in '79, they decided to catalog it and make it a standard one. And a lot of people consider that the gunfighter's barrel length. In 1873, if you wanted to purchase a Colt single-action army revolver, and you were just a normal citizen, it would cost you $17.50. Now, if you were the Army, you'd get a bulk discount, and each gun cost the Army $13. The single-action army is still made today, as I said, by the Colt Custom Shop. But if you want to buy one, it will cost you exactly 100 times the 1873 price. So think about that. What's the point in having a black powder frame Colt if you're not going to shoot it with black powder? Yeah, I like Smith & Wessons, I like Merwin Hulberts, I like Remingtons, I like them all. But if I could only have had one pistol in 1880, this one. So the Colt single-action army became an icon of the Old West and is probably the most recognized pistol revolver on the planet today. Well, the second gun of 1873 that we're going to take a look at today is the model 1873 Winchester rifle. Now, this gun was largely ignored by Hollywood in favor of the model 1892, though Jimmy Stewart did make it famous in Winchester 73. But despite the fact that Hollywood ignored it, this was one of the best-selling rifles of the 19th century, without a doubt. Now, the 73 Winchester was not a breakthrough design. This was an evolutionary design. It had the same action that originally came out during the Civil War years on the Henry rifle. And it had the same King's loading gate and wood forearm that debuted on the model 1866 Yellow Boy. It had a couple of improvements. The most notable improvements were the removable side plates for cleaning and maintenance, and a sliding dust cover on top of the action to keep it clean. But other than that, and a lever-activated safety mechanism. So those were the real changes in the model 1873 as far as the mechanism goes. But what made the model 1873 the popular gun it was the new cartridge that was designed for it. The .44 Winchester centerfire, which is better known to us today as the 4440. The original 4440 cartridge was loaded with a 217 grain 44 caliber bullet, .427 diameter, that was propelled by 40 grains of black powder in a balloon-headed boxer primed case. And it was quite a powerful round compared to the lever-action rounds that went before it, which was the .44 Henry rimfire. It was a whole step up. And most experts will concede that at short ranges of under 200 yards, it may be the best deer cartridge developed during the 19th century. And certainly a lot of deer were taken with it. In fact, most of the old-timers thought for close-in shooting and brush busting, so shooting particularly in the Northeast, that it was superior to the 30-30 at the time, which they thought was a better long-range cartridge. So, just shows you how thinking has changed. In the book Cartridges of the World, author Frank C. Barnes said, "The 4440 is said to have killed more game, large and small, and more men, good and bad, than any other cartridge ever commercially produced." That's saying something. The Model 1873 rifle was in production from 1873 until 1919. A long run, and over 720 Model 1873 rifles were produced during that time. Now, the Model 1873 was available in a variety of formats. You could get it in a saddle ring carbine, you could get it in a musket, which would have a full stock, and you could get it in a variety of rifle configurations: octagon barrel, round barrel, octagon to round, checkered, uncheckered, set triggers, pistol grips, no pistol grips, you name it. It was available during the 19th century. All you had to do was come up with the loot. Speaking of cost, in 1873, the manufacturer's suggested retail price on a Model 1873 rifle was $27. So $10 higher than a Colt single-action Army. But because of their scarcity on the frontier and their huge demand on the frontier, for almost the first decade of production, the actual cost, if you're out west for a 73, was closer to $50. Well, the final gun of 1873 that we're going to look at is the Trapdoor Springfield carbine and rifle. And this is probably the iconic military gun of the late 19th century. Well, the Model 1873 Trapdoor is another example of a gun that was not revolutionary, it was another evolutionary design. When the Civil War ended, the government found itself with about 1 million surplus muzzle-loading .58 caliber rifled muskets. And they were obsolete, because by then everybody knew that the answer going forward was metallic cartridges. But being the frugal, debt-ridden government that we had as a result of the war, they just could not see designing a new gun from scratch and paying for it. They had 1 million of these guns, and there had to be a way to use them. And Erskine Allen, who was the superintendent of the Springfield Armory, came up with the answer, which was basically to cut the back end off of the barrel and slap in a breech-loading mechanism, which they called the trapdoor. And that would allow them to take those 1 million muskets they had and convert them to cartridges for a very small percentage of what it would have cost to manufacture a gun from scratch. And that's what they did. And it ended up being a phenomenal success, though there were a lot of changes along the way. First thing they did was they very quickly ditched that .58 caliber cartridge. It was simply inefficient. So they lined the barrels to .50 caliber and developed the .50-70 government caliber, which was a huge success. And even though it had quite a rainbow trajectory, a lot of buffalo were taken with it. And the gun proved itself in battle almost immediately. In 1867, we had about 28 military guys and 3 contractors, civilian contractors, out of Fort Phil Kearny, and they were attacked by almost 1,000 Oglala Sioux under Red Cloud. This was Red Cloud's war, right? And they took cover behind wagon boxes. They were out to cut hay, and they held off basically the entire Oglala Sioux Nation, just, a couple of dozen guys. They killed hundreds of Sioux, and they took 3 casualties themselves that day. And after numerous charges, the Sioux broke. They had been expecting muzzle-loading weapons, because that's what the settlers out on the trail had been armed with, or the soldiers out on the trail had been armed with up until then. The infantry, the cavalry had Spencer repeating carbines, and the Sioux knew that was trouble. But they were used to the infantry having muzzleloaders, so they expected one shot and then they were going to be able to overrun them with their greater numbers. And it just did not work out that way. And at that point, the government decided they really had a winner, and they stuck with that rifle forever. So that brings us up to 1873. And what happened in 1873 with the trapdoor, which obviously had been around since 1865, is the government settled on a new cartridge, which became known as the 4570 government. And starting in 1873, they made the Springfield trapdoor rifles completely from newly manufactured parts at the Springfield Arsenal. Up until then, they'd been using mostly those surplus guns. But starting in 1873, it was all newly manufactured, and it was all based around the 4570 government cartridge. And that originally fired a 405 grain bullet over 70 grains of black powder, set off with a Bennett internal primer in a soft copper case. That proved to be disastrous at the Little Bighorn. Those soft copper cases, in a huge fight, were heating up too much, and they were sticking in the chamber. And because the copper was so soft, the extractors were ripping right through the base. So guys were using knives trying to pry them out. And I'm here to tell you that is not an easy thing to do. And of course, they were busy being wiped out by the Sioux at that time. So it took a while for changes to occur. And the major change that happened to that rifle, and there were different models of the gun, 1873, 1879, 1881, 1884, 1889, were all variations. But the major variation was the model 1884. As they were developing the model 1884, they also decided to change the 4570 cartridges. And where they had been using one cartridge for both carbines and rifles with a 405 grain hollow base bullet, in the model 1882 cartridge, they made a pretty big change. They went to a 500 grain soft lead bullet over 70 grains of highly compressed black powder as the rifle round. And for the carbine, they kept the hollow-based 405 grain 45 caliber bullet, but they loaded that over 55 grains of black powder. So the ammunition was different for the 1884, and the sighting system was different. Now, the Springfield had been through a few different sighting systems, but they were all very similar. In 1884, the Army debuted the Buffington rear sight. And this is, I would say, the most precise rear sight ever issued on an American standard issue combat rifle. I mean, it's phenomenal. It really is a sniper's sight or a long-range target shooter's sight. It is not a great combat sight because it's way too complicated. But it's phenomenal. I mean, it even takes into account bullet drift at long range due to the rifling pitch. I mean, it's unbelievable. But you can tell from this instruction sheet, there's a lot going on. Now, I'll probably do, I have an 1884 carbine, by the way. My original trapdoor that you've seen in a lot of these pictures is an 1884 that has a Buffington rear sight on it. And probably in the spring, I'll do a video on that. I've had this gun for a number of years. I've never videoed it, so it's probably time to get that done and give you a look at what that looks like. But that was the final version. We got just some tweaks going on from there. Overall, if you took all of the 45 caliber models that we just talked about and added up the production runs of them, it's well over 400,000 rifles. So there's no doubt that this rifle had an impact, and of course the cartridge had an impact that lived long after the service life of the rifle. I mean, we still use the 4570. There are lever guns still being chambered in 4570 today. It's just an outstanding cartridge. And I think one of the best cartridges of the 19th century, because there are more powerful cartridges, but the 4570 has an optimal mix almost of power and shootability. I find with black powder loads, it does not beat you up. It's a gun you can shoot for a long time. If you shoot a 45 120, man, you know it. I mean, you know it. That thing can rock you. But I find the 4570 to be a real versatile round, especially with black powder. I prefer it with black powder to smokeless. And I've always loved the Trapdoor Springfield, and it deserves its place as one of the iconic guns of the American West. Not bad. Get out of there. There we go. Now this gun has a fairly weak ejector. I've owned two original Trapdoors and they kick them right out, but this one just barely gets them out of there. Well, that wraps up our look at the guns of 1873. There was a lot of ground to cover, and honestly, I hope I did not wear out my welcome with you with this long-winded video, but it's a subject I find very interesting, and I hope that some of you do as well. And one way or another, good or bad, let me know in the comments, because I really do like to know, and I promise I read them all. So let me know, and until next week, bye.